A chill wind sweeps across broken roads, where moss creeps over shattered stones once laid by legionnaires. A crumbling watchtower leans into the grey sky, its flame long extinguished. Amid the ruins, smoke curls from new hearths, rough settlements where hammers ring and banners bearing unfamiliar crests flutter in the cold. In these wild frontiers, armoured riders gather, not beneath imperial eagles, but under sigils born of ambition. A child clutches a wooden sword, while elders whisper of distant Rome. Across muddy fields, a lone figure on horseback surveys the land, his eyes not on what is, but what could be. From these scattered fragments, he begins to shape something vast and untried. This is the rise of Charlemagne, not sudden, but forged slowly, through fire, oath, and vision, until the world remembers what it had forgotten. That greatness can rise again if only someone dares to build it. The fall of Rome shattered Europe into fragments, though the shadow of empire lingered. In 476 AD, it wasn't war that ended the Western Roman Empire, but the quiet removal of a child emperor, Romulus Augustulus, pushed aside by his own Germanic commander. As the purple cloak of imperial authority slipped from his trembling shoulders, something far greater than a single dynasty died with him. Political unity that had bound Western Europe for 5 centuries shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone, leaving behind a continent of warring tribes, crumbling cities, and forgotten roads that led nowhere. Among the smoking ruins of the Western Empire, new powers stirred. Across former Roman territories, Germanic warlords carved out kingdoms from the corpse of Caesar's legacy. In Spain, Visigoths built their capital at Toledo, where Arian Christian kings ruled over Roman subjects with an uneasy blend of Gothic tradition and imperial ceremony. Italian territories saw Ostrogoths under Theodoric the Great attempt something unprecedented, to govern Romans as Romans while remaining Gothic in their hearts, a delicate balance that would outlive its creator by mere decades. What distinguished Gaul, that rich heartland that had once been Julius Caesar's prize, was where revolutionary seeds began to take root. Here, among forests and fertile valleys that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, a tribe of Salian Franks had established themselves not as conquerors, but as something far more dangerous, inheritors. Blood and ambition in equal measure sparked this transformation in the closing decades of the 5th century. A young Frankish king named Clovis looked out from his stronghold at Tournai and saw opportunity written across the fractured landscape of post-Roman Gaul. Unlike his Germanic cousins, who clung to their ancestral gods or embraced the heretical Arianism that marked them as outsiders, Clovis possessed something that would prove more valuable than any sword: political genius. Near Tolbiac, around 496, destiny arrived on a battlefield where Clovis faced the Alemanni in a contest that would determine the fate of northeastern Gaul. As his warriors wavered under the fierce assault of Germanic axes and spears, Clovis made a decision that would echo through the centuries. Raising his eyes to the grey winter sky, he called upon the god of his Burgundian wife Clotilde, not the distant Aryan deity of his rivals, but the Orthodox Christ worshipped by the Roman populations he sought to rule. God of Clotilde, tradition records him crying above the din of battle. If you grant me victory today, I will bow before your cross and be baptized in your name. Whether divine intervention or tactical brilliance turned the tide, Clovis emerged victorious, and with that victory came a transformation that would reshape European civilization. Christmas Day, 508, witnessed something unprecedented in the ancient Roman city of Reims. Before an audience of Frankish warriors and Gallo-Roman bishops, King Clovis descended into the baptismal waters as a pagan barbarian and emerged as the first Orthodox Christian king in Western Europe. Bishop Remigius, performing the ceremony, spoke words that seemed prophetic. "Bow your head humbly, Sicambrian. Worship what you have burned. Burn what you have worshipped." Far more than religious theatre unfolded in that moment. Clovis had accomplished what no other Germanic ruler had managed. He had become Roman without ceasing to be Frank. Gallo-Roman aristocracy, powerful bishops who commanded both spiritual and temporal authority, and common people who still thought of themselves as citizens of a vanished empire, could now see in this barbarian king something they had thought lost forever: legitimate authority blessed by the God of their fathers. What followed revealed staggering political implications. Overnight, Clovis transformed from another tribal warlord into the rightful heir of imperial power in Gaul, while Arian Visigoths and Ostrogoths remained forever foreign in the eyes of their Catholic subjects. This Frankish monarch could claim divine sanction for his rule. Germanic military prowess merged with classical administrative tradition and Christian legitimacy to create something entirely new. A barbarian realm that could claim to be more Roman than Rome itself. Understanding the weapon he had forged, Clovis turned it against his rivals with calculating precision. Burgundian kingdoms fell to coordinated campaigns that combined Frankish ferocity with Roman tactical discipline. When King Alaric II died beneath Frankish swords at the Battle of Vouillers in 507, his Visigothic realm of Toulouse crumbled, reduced to a precarious foothold in the mountains of Spain. One by one, petty kings and tribal chieftains of Gaul bent the knee or felt the bite of Frankish steel. By his death in 511, Clovis had achieved something that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. From his original stronghold at Tournai, Frankish dominion now stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees, from the English Channel to the Mediterranean. Political patchwork of tribal territories that had characterized post-Roman Gaul was being forged into something approaching unity under a single crown. Clovis's greatest achievement transcended territorial conquest. He had created a new synthesis that would outlast any individual campaign. In great stone basilicas that rose in Frankish cities, Germanic warriors knelt beside Roman senators before altars where Latin prayers echoed off walls decorated with Byzantine mosaics. Frankish law codes incorporated classical legal principles, while Roman administrative methods were adapted to serve Germanic concepts of personal loyalty and honor. Among the most significant changes was the emergence of a new aristocracy that combined the best of both worlds. Gallo-Roman senators who had preserved their wealth and learning through the collapse married their daughters to Frankish warriors who had gained land through conquest. Their children spoke Latin as easily as they handled swords, wrote poetry as skillfully as they rode horses, and understood both complex protocols of diplomatic negotiation and fierce simplicities of Germanic honor codes. But the Merovingian synthesis, named for Clovis's legendary ancestor Merovec, carried within it the seeds of its own transformation. Frankish tradition demanded that a king's realm be divided among his sons, and Clovis's death in 511 saw his carefully unified kingdom split 4 ways. Paris, Orléans, Reims, and Soissons became rival capitals, each ruled by a son who inherited his father's ambitions, but only a fragment of his power. The civil wars that followed revealed both the strength and weakness of what Clovis had created. Brothers fought brothers with armies that mixed Frankish infantry and Roman cavalry, using siege engines built by Roman engineers to storm fortresses defended by Gothic mercenaries. The violence was spectacular and pointless, consuming the very resources that had made the kingdom strong, while creating opportunities for enemies both internal and external. Most dangerous of all were the mayors of the palace, originally household officials responsible for managing royal estates and coordinating daily administration. As Merovingian rulers exhausted themselves in fratricidal warfare, these mayors gradually accumulated the real levers of governance. They controlled royal revenues, commanded royal armies, and increasingly made the decisions that shaped policy across Frankish territories. The shift was subtle at first, masked by ceremonial deference and traditional forms. Kings still wore crowns and issued laws, still received foreign ambassadors and presided over great assemblies. But increasingly, they did so under the watchful eyes of mayors who had become the true arbiters of Frankish power. The kings might reign, but the mayors ruled, a distinction that would have profound consequences for the future. This transformation was most pronounced in Austrasia, the easternmost of the Frankish kingdoms, where proximity to Germanic tribes and constant warfare had created a particularly martial culture. Here, among the forests and fortified towns that guarded the Rhine frontier, a family began to emerge whose name would become synonymous with power. The Arnulfings, later known as the Pippinids, after their most famous representative. Pippin of Herstal, who dominated Austrasian politics in the late 7th century, embodied the new reality of Frankish governance. Officially merely the mayor of the palace to a Merovingian king, whose name history barely remembers, Pippin commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and distributed lands with all the authority of a sovereign ruler. Foreign diplomats quickly learned that the real power in Austrasia resided not in the royal palace, but in the mayor's hall, where practical decisions were made by practical men. The Austrasian heartland had been forged by constant warfare into something approaching a military state. Here, land tenure was increasingly tied to military service, creating a class of warrior farmers who could be mobilized quickly for campaigns against Saxon raiders, Alemannian tribes, or rival Frankish kingdoms. The old Roman distinction between civilian and military authority meant little in a society where survival depended on the ability to summon armed forces at a moment's notice. Pippin understood that power in this new world came not from ancient bloodlines or ceremonial titles, but from the ability to deliver results. He built his authority on a foundation of military success, administrative competence, and calculated generosity to those who served him faithfully. His followers received grants of land in exchange for military service. His allies found their interests protected and advanced. And his enemies discovered that defying the mayor of the palace carried consequences that no royal protection could prevent. The economic foundations of this emerging system were as revolutionary as its political structures. The collapse of Roman commercial networks had forced local communities to become largely self-sufficient, but this transformation created new opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. The vast estates that Pippin controlled produced not just agricultural surplus, but specialized goods, weapons, metalwork, textiles, that could be traded across the surviving commercial networks that connected the Frankish territories with the wider world. Silver, flowing from mines in the Harz Mountains and Saxon territories, began to replace the gold-based currency that had characterized the late Roman economy. This shift reflected deeper changes in how wealth was created and distributed. Where Roman aristocrats had lived off the rents of distant estates worked by slaves, Frankish magnates derived their power from personal relationships with warrior farmers who held their lands in exchange for military service. The bonds of loyalty that held this system together were intensely personal, creating networks of obligation that could be mobilized for war or governance with remarkable efficiency. Faith was reshaped too. While still loyal to Roman orthodoxy, the Frankish church began to reflect the values and mindset of the warrior elites who backed it. Bishops were often warrior nobles who had taken holy orders, equally comfortable blessing weapons and wielding them. Monasteries served as centers of learning and agricultural innovation, but they were also fortified strongholds that could shelter communities during times of war. When Christian devotion met the warrior spirit of the Germanic world, it formed a powerful religious identity that deeply influenced Europe's path. The concept of holy war, fighting to defend or extend Christian territory, emerged naturally from this synthesis. Frankish warriors could see their battles against pagan Saxons or Arian Lombards as religious duties blessed by God, while their victories could be interpreted as divine approval of their cause. This militant Christianity found expression in the growing cult of warrior saints, martyrs and confessors, whose stories emphasized courage in battle and steadfastness in the face of persecution. The legendary accounts of saints like Martin of Tours, a Roman soldier who became a Christian bishop, or Denis of Paris, who supposedly carried his own severed head after his martyrdom, captured the imagination of warriors who sought to reconcile their martial profession with their Christian faith. By the closing decades of the 7th century, the transformation of post-Roman Gaul was approaching completion. The Merovingian kingdoms, while still officially separate, were increasingly dominated by the expanding power of Austrasian mayors. The old Roman administrative structures had been largely replaced by Germanic systems of personal loyalty and military service. Most importantly, a new cultural synthesis had emerged that combined the best elements of Roman, Christian, and Germanic traditions. Yet this transformation remained incomplete, limited by the persistence of traditional forms and the continued division of Frankish power among competing kingdoms. The system that Pippin of Herstal had created was impressive but inherently unstable, dependent on the personal abilities of individual leaders and vulnerable to the succession crises that periodically paralyzed Germanic societies. What was needed was a leader who could complete the revolution that Clovis had begun, someone who possessed not just the military and political skills necessary for conquest, but the vision to create institutions that could outlast any individual ruler. That leader was already being born in the Austrasian heartland, though few could have predicted the role he would play in reshaping European civilization. Charles, the illegitimate son of Pippin of Herstal, would grow up in a world where power belonged to those strong enough to seize it and clever enough to keep it. The lessons he learned in the forests and fortified halls of Austrasia would serve him well when he faced challenges that would test every aspect of the Frankish synthesis that his predecessors had created. The stage was set for the emergence of a figure whose hammer would forge not just military victories, but the political and cultural foundations of a new European order. In the competition between mayors and kings, between Germanic tradition and Roman legacy, between Christian unity and political fragmentation, the outcome remained uncertain. But the forces that would shape that outcome were already gathering strength in the Rhineland strongholds, where a new generation of Frankish leaders was preparing to write the next chapter of European history. Roman power didn't vanish with Romulus or Augustulus. It splintered, glowing faintly in the new barbarian kingdoms born from the empire's collapse. Now, in the hands of the Frankish mayors who truly ruled from the shadows, those embers were being carefully tended and fed, waiting for the breath that would kindle them into a flame bright enough to illuminate a new imperial dawn. Long before Charlemagne, there was Charles the Hammer, ushering in the birth of a new Frankish future. But when Pippin of Herstal died in 714, the fragile structure of Austrasian power looked ready to collapse like a tower on shifting ground. His legitimate heir was a child, powerless against the ambitions of rival mayors and hostile neighboring realms. Into this chaos stepped a figure whose very existence challenged every assumption about legitimate rule in the early 8th century. Charles, Pippin's bastard son, born of a concubine named Alpida, but possessed of a will that would reshape the destiny of Europe. Illegitimacy in Germanic society was not the absolute bar to succession. It would become in later centuries, but it remained a dangerous weakness that enemies could exploit. The bastard faced immediate challenges from his own stepmother, Plectrude, who sought to preserve power for her infant grandson, and from external rivals who sensed opportunity in Austrasian weakness. Neustrian forces under Mayor Ragenfried and their Frisian allies swept eastward, confident they could dismember the Austrasian heartland, while its defenders squabbled over succession. What they encountered instead was something unprecedented, an illegitimate claimant who fought like a man with nothing to lose, because that was precisely what he was. The bastard, known to his Germanic followers as Karl, gathered around himself the desperate and dispossessed, warriors who had been marginalized by the established order, and now saw in this questionable heir a path to advancement that traditional loyalty networks had denied them. These men followed him not because of his bloodline, but because he promised them something more valuable than legitimacy: victory. Chronicles of the time described the mayor as possessing an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in soldiers who had every reason to doubt his cause. Where other leaders relied on inherited respect or ceremonial authority, Pippin's son built his following through personal charisma and an uncanny understanding of what motivated fighting men. He shared their hardships, remembered their names, and most importantly, delivered on his promises of plunder and advancement for those who served him faithfully. His first great test came at the Battle of Amblève in 716, when Neustrian forces, confident of easy victory, found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to materialize from the very forests themselves. The Austrasian had learned the harsh lessons that his homeland's position as a frontier region taught, that survival depended on mobility, surprise, and the ability to strike decisively before enemies could coordinate their responses. His warriors moved through the dense woodlands like hunting wolves, appearing suddenly to savage exposed flanks before melting away into terrain they knew better than their own heartlands. Victory at Amblève was more than military triumph. It was a political earthquake that announced the arrival of a new kind of leader. Word spread rapidly across the territories that Pippin's bastard son possessed something that legitimate heirs often lacked: the ability to win battles against overwhelming odds. Warriors began deserting established leaders to join a man who might be base-born, but who clearly enjoyed divine favor on the battlefield. Karl understood that military success alone would not secure lasting dominance. Throughout the next decade, he methodically dismantled the coalition of enemies that had nearly destroyed Austrasian hegemony, while simultaneously revolutionizing the very foundations of Germanic military organization. Where previous mayors had relied on traditional warrior bands held together by personal loyalty and the promise of seasonal campaigns, the bastard began creating something approaching a professional military force. Central to this transformation was his radical approach to landholding and military service. Recognizing that the church had accumulated vast estates across the territories, while many potential warriors lacked the resources necessary to equip themselves properly for campaign, the mayor began a systematic redistribution that would have profound consequences for both religious and secular authority. Ecclesiastical properties were confiscated and granted to warriors in exchange for military service, creating a new class of landed fighters whose loyalty was tied directly to their patrons' continued success. This policy of secularization horrified clerical authorities, who saw generations of pious donations being handed over to rough soldiers more interested in warfare than salvation. Yet the Austrasian possessed a keen understanding of political realities that transcended immediate religious objections. By tying military service to land tenure, he was creating institutional foundations that could survive individual personalities and succession crises. His followers now had concrete stakes in the system's continuation that went beyond personal loyalty to a single charismatic leader. Agricultural innovations during this period provided the economic foundation necessary to support these military reforms. The introduction of the heavy moldboard plough from Slavic territories dramatically increased productivity on the fertile soils of northern France, while the development of the three-field system allowed more intensive cultivation without exhausting the land. These advances meant that the territories could support larger populations and feed more warriors than ever before, giving their ruler demographic advantages that his enemies could not match. Perhaps most importantly, these agricultural changes were accompanied by the spread of new technologies that would transform European warfare. The stirrup, introduced from Central Asian nomadic peoples through trade networks that connected the realm to the broader Eurasian world, revolutionized cavalry combat by allowing mounted warriors to deliver devastating charges without losing their seats. Karl was among the first leaders to recognize the tactical implications of this innovation and to systematically train his followers in its use. By the late 720s, the bastard had achieved something that would have seemed impossible during the dark days following his father's death. Austrasian authority had been restored and extended. Rival mayors had been eliminated or subordinated, and the territories were more unified under a single leadership than they had been since the reign of Dagobert a century earlier. Yet the greatest test of his revolutionary system was about to arrive from an entirely unexpected direction. Across the Pyrenees, the Umayyad Caliphate had completed its conquest of Visigothic Spain with a speed that stunned Christian Europe. The great fortress cities that had resisted Germanic tribes for centuries fell to Muslim armies in less than a decade, their defenders either dead or fled into the mountain fastnesses of Asturias. By 720, Islamic forces were probing north of the Pyrenees, testing the strength of northern defenses and seeking opportunities for expansion into the rich territories of Gaul. What made this threat particularly dangerous was not just the military prowess of the Islamic armies, but their sophisticated understanding of the political divisions that weakened Christian resistance. Muslim commanders had studied the rivalries between kingdoms, the tensions between mayors and nominal rulers, and the religious disputes that divided Catholic populations from their Arian neighbors. They came not as mindless raiders seeking quick plunder, but as conquerors prepared to exploit every weakness in the fragmented political landscape of post-Roman Europe. Initial Islamic incursions into Aquitaine met with limited resistance from Duke Odo, whose forces were organized along traditional lines and unprepared for enemies who combined desert mobility with siege techniques learned from conquered Persian and Byzantine territories. City after city opened its gates rather than face the systematic destruction that Islamic armies could inflict on populations that chose resistance over submission. By 732, Muslim forces had advanced deep into the heart of Gaul, their cavalry ranging as far north as the Loire Valley. Duke Odo's desperate appeal to the Austrasian for assistance represented more than a call for military aid. It was an acknowledgement that traditional military organization had proven inadequate against this new threat. The established nobility of Aquitaine, with their emphasis on individual combat prowess and feudal obligation, could not match the disciplined coordination and tactical flexibility that characterized Islamic warfare. Only the revolutionary military system that Karl had been developing in his homeland offered hope of effective resistance. The mayor's response revealed the strategic thinking that would make him legendary. Rather than rushing south to meet the Islamic advance, he spent precious weeks ensuring that his forces were properly equipped and organized for the kind of warfare they would face. His warriors practiced fighting in coordinated formations rather than as individual heroes, learned to maintain discipline under cavalry charges, and most importantly, developed the mental resilience necessary to face enemies whose military reputation had already begun to assume mythical proportions. When the hammer finally marched south in October 732, he brought with him not just an army, but a new conception of how Christian Europe should defend itself against external threats. His forces were organized along lines that reflected the social and military innovations he had been implementing for nearly 2 decades. These were not traditional Germanic war bands, following a charismatic leader in search of personal glory, but something approaching a professional military force committed to defending their territories and their faith against invaders who threatened both. The confrontation that would make the bastard famous throughout Christendom took place on the road between Tours and Poitiers, at a site whose exact location remains disputed by historians, but whose significance in European memory cannot be questioned. For 7 days, the two armies faced each other across the October landscape, each waiting for the other to make the first move in a battle that both sides understood would determine the future of Christian Europe. Contemporary chronicles describe the Islamic army as a glittering host that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, their colorful banners and elaborate equipment reflecting the wealth of conquered territories from Spain to Persia. These were veteran warriors who had defeated the finest armies of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian realm, led by commanders who had never known defeat in battles across 3 continents. Their confidence was not misplaced. They possessed superior mobility, more sophisticated siege equipment, and tactical doctrines that had proven effective against every enemy they had encountered. What they had not encountered was the military system that the Austrasian had been perfecting in the forests and plains of his homeland. When battle was finally joined, the Islamic cavalry charges that had shattered so many enemy formations met something unprecedented. Northern infantry that maintained cohesion under pressure, supported by cavalry units that had learned to coordinate their movements with foot soldiers rather than seeking individual glory. Most importantly, these Christian warriors fought with the desperate determination of men defending their homes against invaders who offered only submission or death. The battle's climax came when Islamic forces, frustrated by their inability to break the formations, concentrated their efforts against what appeared to be the weakest point in Karl's line. Instead of the collapse they expected, they found themselves drawn into a carefully prepared trap, where reserves could strike their flanks while the main body maintained its defensive position. The death of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the Islamic commander, in this melee marked the beginning of a rout that would echo across Europe and the Islamic world. Victory at Tours transformed the mayor from a successful regional leader into the defender of Christendom itself. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find language adequate to describe what he had accomplished. A bastard son who had risen from apparent powerlessness to defeat the most feared military force in the known world. The nickname Martel, the Hammer, captured both his devastating effectiveness in battle and his role in forging a new European identity that combined Germanic military prowess with Christian religious purpose. Despite the scale of the triumph, there was no illusion. It would take more than a single victory to build lasting safety. Throughout the remainder of the 730s, he systematically extended Austrasian authority into regions that had been beyond effective control since the collapse of Roman administration. Burgundy, Provence, and Bavaria all felt the weight of his arms as the hammer eliminated potential rivals and created buffer zones against future Islamic incursions from the south and Magyar raids from the east. These campaigns revealed the maturation of the military and administrative systems that the leader had been developing since his rise to power. Northern armies now moved with a coordination and strategic purpose that reflected careful planning rather than opportunistic raiding. Supply systems ensured that forces could operate far from their home territories for extended periods, while intelligence networks provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and political situations. Most importantly, conquered territories were integrated into the expanding system through a combination of military occupation and administrative innovation that created lasting political structures. Religious policy during this period reflected Karl's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military conquest and cultural integration. Rather than simply imposing customs on conquered populations, he worked closely with local bishops and religious authorities to create hybrid institutions that could command loyalty from diverse ethnic and linguistic communities. The expansion of authority was accompanied by the systematic promotion of Orthodox Christianity and the suppression of religious practices that divided potential subjects from their new rulers. Missionary activity, particularly the work of Anglo-Saxon clerics like Boniface, provided crucial support for these policies of cultural integration. These foreign missionaries possessed both the linguistic skills necessary to communicate with diverse populations and the religious authority required to legitimate political changes in spiritual terms. Their success in converting pagan populations and reforming corrupt clergy created networks of obligation and loyalty that complemented the military and administrative structures the mayor was establishing. By the time of his death in 741, the hammer had fundamentally transformed both his territories and the broader European political landscape. What had been a collection of competing kingdoms and petty principalities was becoming a unified Christian realm capable of defending itself against external threats and projecting power far beyond its original boundaries. The military innovations he had pioneered were being adopted by rulers across Europe, while the administrative systems he had developed provided models for governance that would influence European development for centuries. Perhaps most importantly, Karl had demonstrated that effective leadership in the post-Roman world required more than inherited legitimacy or traditional charisma. Success demanded the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, to innovate in response to new challenges, and to create institutions that could outlast individual personalities. His bastard origins, initially a source of weakness, had forced him to develop qualities of flexibility and determination that proved more valuable than any royal bloodline. The legacy the mayor left to his sons was not just territorial expansion or military success, but a new understanding of what leadership could accomplish. He had shown that the scattered descendants of Germanic tribes could unite to defend Christian Europe against its enemies, that innovative military and administrative systems could overcome traditional advantages of wealth and established authority, and that effective governance required the systematic integration of conquest with cultural and religious transformation. When the hammer died in 741, he left behind a realm that extended from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, unified under institutions that combined the best elements of Germanic, Roman, and Christian traditions. His sons would inherit not just territory and authority, but the revolutionary vision that had made such expansion possible. The stage was set for the next phase of development, when inherited power would be transformed into legitimate kingship, and the hammer of this bastard son would be refined into the crown of his descendants. The boy who would become Charlemagne was already being born into this transformed world, where northern authority was no longer questioned and Christian unity was no longer just an aspiration, but an achievable goal. The foundations had been laid for an empire that would dwarf even the achievements of the hammer, built on the military, administrative, and cultural innovations that this illegitimate heir had forged in the crucible of early medieval Europe. When the hammer died in 741, the great question that had haunted European politics for generations arose once more. Who truly ruled when the king was a shadow and the mayor held all real control? The answer would come not through battlefield prowess or political maneuvering, but through an audacious theological gambit that would reshape the relationship between temporal rule and divine sanction for centuries to come. Karl's death split his vast inheritance between two sons whose contrasting personalities seemed to embody the tensions within the system their father had created. Charlemagne, the elder, possessed the martial virtues that had made the lineage great. He was tall, powerfully built, and gifted with the kind of personal magnetism that could inspire warriors to follow him into impossible odds. His younger brother Pippin presented a stark contrast. Short of stature, scholarly in temperament, and more comfortable in the company of bishops than warriors. Yet it was this unlikely heir who would prove to have inherited the most essential quality of his bloodline, the ability to see opportunities that others missed. Initially, the division seemed to work as their father had intended. Charlemagne took the eastern regions, where his military talents could be employed against Saxon raiders and Bavarian rebels, while his brother governed the western lands where diplomatic skill and administrative competence were more valuable than prowess in battle. For several years, the brothers cooperated effectively, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that strengthened the overall position of their house. Yet beneath this apparent harmony lay fundamental disagreements about the direction their realm should take. Charlemagne embodied the traditional Germanic approach to leadership. He believed that rule came from the ability to lead warriors in battle, and that standing flowed from personal relationships forged in the crucible of shared danger. The younger brother, influenced by his extensive contacts with ecclesiastical officials, had begun to envision something radically different, a form of rulership that derived its validation not from military success, but from divine approval formally recognized by the Church. This philosophical divide came to a head during the early 740s, as both brothers faced the challenge of governing lands that had outgrown traditional methods of control. The realm that the hammer had bequeathed to them stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, encompassing peoples who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and recognized different forms of valid rule. Military force alone could not hold such a diverse collection of regions together. What was needed was some form of unifying principle that could command loyalty across ethnic and cultural boundaries. Charlemagne's solution was to intensify the military character of their rule, launching aggressive campaigns against external enemies that would provide plunder for followers and demonstrate the lineage's continued vitality. His expeditions against the Saxons achieved spectacular tactical successes, bringing back enormous quantities of treasure and slaves while establishing buffer zones along the dangerous eastern frontier. Yet these victories, however impressive, did nothing to address the fundamental question of standing that hung over their entire system of governance. The younger brother approached the problem from an entirely different angle. Rather than seeking to strengthen the existing arrangement, he began to question whether the fiction of Merovingian kingship served any useful purpose. The nominal rulers who bore the royal title had become so insignificant that contemporaries referred to them as do-nothing kings, figures who presided over ceremonial functions while real decisions were made in the mayor's hall. This arrangement might have satisfied earlier generations, but the younger brother recognized that it was becoming a source of weakness rather than strength. It was through ongoing dialogue with clergy from across Europe that the insight emerged, one that would leave a lasting mark on history. Anglo-Saxon missionaries like Boniface, who had been working to reform the church in Germanic territories, brought with them sophisticated theological concepts about the relationship between earthly authority and divine will. These clerics argued that legitimate rulership required more than military success or inherited position. It demanded formal recognition by God's representatives on earth. What made this idea revolutionary was not its theological content, but its political implications. If divine approval was the true source of legitimate authority, then the existing arrangement that placed real power in the hands of mayors, while formal kingship remained with the Merovingians, was not just inefficient, it was blasphemous. God's will was being thwarted by human conventions that prevented the most capable rulers from receiving the recognition their achievements deserved. By 747, Pippin had developed these ideas into a concrete political program. Rather than continuing to serve as mayor under an ineffective Merovingian king, he would seek formal recognition as ruler in his own right. This was not mere ambition. It was a theological necessity that would align earthly political arrangements with divine intentions. The church, which had been the greatest beneficiary of the dynasty's protection and patronage, would surely recognize the justice of such a transformation. The moment of decision came when Charlemagne, seemingly at the height of his power and success, announced his intention to abandon secular life and enter a monastery. The reasons for this shocking decision remain mysterious. Contemporary sources suggest everything from genuine religious conversion to exhaustion with the burdens of governance. Whatever his motivations, Carloman's withdrawal left Pippin as sole ruler of territories that his father had divided between two capable sons. This unexpected consolidation of power provided the opportunity Pippin had been waiting for, but it also created new dangers. Without his brother's military reputation to legitimize their rule, the mayor faced potential challenges from rival noble families who might question his right to govern territories that had been conquered by the hammer's sword. Traditional Germanic concepts of legitimacy suggested that power belonged to those strong enough to seize and hold it, but Pippin's physical limitations made such an approach impractical. Instead, he chose to implement the revolutionary strategy he had been developing through his correspondence with ecclesiastical authorities. In 750, Pippin dispatched an embassy to Rome, carrying a question that would echo through the ages. Should he who holds the power also hold the title of king? The query was addressed to Pope Zacharias, but its implications extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of one realm's succession crisis. Pope Zacharias understood perfectly what was being asked of him. This was not a request for theological guidance, but an invitation to participate in a fundamental reconstruction of the relationship between secular and religious authority. By recognizing Pippin's claim to legitimate kingship, the papacy would be asserting its right to determine who could legitimately rule Christian territories. Such a precedent could prove enormously valuable in future disputes with other secular rulers who might challenge papal authority. The Pope's response was everything Pippin could have hoped for. Zacharias declared that it was indeed better for the man who held real power to bear the title of king, rather than allowing legitimate authority to remain with those who could not exercise it effectively. This was more than permission. It was a theological mandate that transformed Pippin's political ambitions into a religious duty. Armed with papal approval, Pippin moved to implement the most dramatic political transformation in Europe since the fall of Rome. In 751, at Soissons, he was formally elected king by an assembly of nobles and bishops who recognized both his practical capabilities and his divine sanction. The last Merovingian ruler, Childeric III, was deposed and confined to a monastery, ending a dynasty that had ruled the territories for over 2 centuries. Even such a groundbreaking act couldn't fully erase the uncertainty surrounding the new dynasty's right to rule. Pippin understood that formal recognition by nobles and bishops, while necessary, lacked the dramatic symbolism required to capture popular imagination and convince potential rivals that divine will truly supported his claim. What was needed was a ceremony that would make God's approval visible to all who witnessed it. The solution came through the unprecedented step of inviting the Pope himself to cross the Alps and personally anoint the new king. In 754, Pope Stephen II made the dangerous journey from Rome to the northern territories, carrying with him the sacred oils that would transform Pippin from a successful mayor into a divinely appointed monarch. The ceremony that followed at Saint-Denis represented the formal birth of what would become known as the Carolingian dynasty. The ceremony carried an aura of the mystical, as if divine favor itself had descended. When the holy oils touched Pippin's forehead, witnesses felt they were observing something unprecedented in the post-Roman world: the creation of a new form of Christian kingship that combined Germanic warrior traditions with biblical concepts of divine appointment. The Pope's participation elevated the ceremony far above ordinary political events, making it a sacramental act that commanded recognition throughout Christian Europe. Most significantly, the Pope extended his blessing to Pippin's entire family, anointing not just the new king, but also his wife Bertrada and their young sons, including a boy named after his grandfather, who would one day be known as Charlemagne. This family consecration established the principle that divine approval extended not just to one individual, but to an entire lineage that God had chosen to rule Christian territories. The political implications of this theological revolution were immediately apparent. Other European rulers, who had previously viewed the mayor as merely a successful warlord, now had to acknowledge him as a divinely appointed king whose authority came directly from God. Potential rebels faced not just military defeat, but the prospect of opposing God's chosen representative on earth. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, few could remember when the territories had been ruled by anyone other than the Carolingian house. Yet papal approval came with obligations as well as benefits. Pope Stephen's journey north had been motivated by more than theological concerns. The papal territories in Italy were under severe pressure from Lombard expansion, and the pontiff desperately needed military assistance from his newly anointed ally. The price of divine sanction would be paid in blood and treasure, as Pippin committed his forces to defending papal interests in the complex political landscape of 8th century Italy. The Italian campaigns that followed revealed both the opportunities and challenges created by the new alliance between temporal and spiritual authority. Pippin's armies, fighting under the banner of defending the church, achieved remarkable successes against Lombard forces that had seemed poised to overrun the papal territories. The capture of Ravenna and other key cities demonstrated that northern military techniques, refined through generations of frontier warfare, could be devastatingly effective against more traditional forms of organized resistance. More importantly, these victories established the principle that would define European politics for centuries. The secular ruler who enjoyed papal support could legitimately intervene in the affairs of other Christian territories to defend church interests. This was revolutionary doctrine that transformed localized political disputes into conflicts with broader religious significance. How the rewards were divided spoke volumes about the fresh alliance forming between royal power and papal authority. Rather than keeping conquered territories for himself, as previous Germanic rulers would have done, Pippin formally presented extensive lands to the papacy, creating what would become known as the Papal States. This donation of Pippin represented more than territorial transfer. It was the physical manifestation of the theological principles that had brought the new dynasty to power. By establishing the Pope as a temporal ruler with his own territories to govern, Pippin was creating a permanent alliance that would outlast individual personalities and political circumstances. Future Carolingian rulers could count on papal support, because the papacy's own territorial interests depended on maintaining good relations with the dynasty that had made papal temporal power possible. The economic foundations that supported these military and diplomatic initiatives reflected the agricultural revolution that had been transforming northern European society throughout the 8th century. The introduction of new ploughing techniques, crop rotation systems, and animal husbandry methods had dramatically increased agricultural productivity, providing the surplus necessary to support larger armies and more extensive governmental operations. The realm could now afford the kind of sustained military campaigns in distant territories that would have been impossible for earlier rulers. Perhaps most significantly, these agricultural advances were accompanied by the expansion of trade networks that connected the Carolingian territories to markets across Europe and beyond. Merchants from the North Sea to the Mediterranean recognized the stability and security that the new dynasty provided, leading to commercial expansion that generated unprecedented wealth for both rulers and subjects. The silver that flowed through these trade networks provided the monetary foundation for military and administrative innovations that would define the dynasty's later achievements. Religious policy during this period reflected the sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cultural integration and political stability that Pippin had inherited from his father. Rather than simply imposing uniform religious practices on conquered populations, the king worked systematically to reform existing ecclesiastical institutions while respecting local traditions that did not conflict with orthodox doctrine. This approach proved far more effective than coercive conversion in creating lasting loyalty among diverse subject populations. The missionary activities that accompanied territorial expansion were similarly sophisticated, combining genuine religious enthusiasm with careful attention to political implications. Anglo-Saxon clerics like Boniface continued to play crucial roles in these efforts, their foreign origins allowing them to serve as neutral arbiters in disputes between different ethnic and linguistic communities, while their undoubted piety gave them credibility with populations suspicious of political motives. By the time of Pippin's death in 768, the transformation he had initiated was complete. What had been a collection of territories held together by military force and personal loyalty had become a Christian kingdom whose legitimacy rested on divine sanction, formally recognized by the Church. The institutional innovations he had pioneered, the alliance with the papacy, the integration of religious and secular authority, the systematic use of ecclesiastical networks for governmental purposes, would provide the foundation for achievements that would dwarf even his own remarkable accomplishments. The two sons who inherited his realm would face challenges that required all the political, military, and religious resources their father had assembled. The world of 768 was more dangerous and more complex than the one Pippin had inherited from the hammer. But it was also full of opportunities for rulers who possessed the vision and capability to exploit them. The stage was set for the next act in the drama that would culminate in the restoration of imperial authority in Western Europe. Among those sons, one would prove to possess not just his father's political genius and his grandfather's military prowess, but something even more valuable: the ability to synthesize all the innovations of his predecessors into a vision of Christian empire that would reshape the medieval world. The boy who had been anointed alongside his father in 754 was about to inherit a legacy that would make possible achievements beyond the dreams of any previous European ruler. The foundation stones had been laid, the institutional framework had been established, and the divine sanction had been secured. All that remained was for the right individual to build upon these foundations, something that would echo through history as one of the greatest experiments in governance that the medieval world would ever witness. When the short king breathed his last at Saint-Denis in 768, his final words reportedly urged his sons to rule together in harmony, sharing the vast Frankish realm their grandfather's hammer had forged and their father's cunning had legitimized. Yet even as the funeral rites were performed, astute observers could sense the impossibility of such an arrangement. Two eagles, the court poets whispered, could not share the same sky. The division of the kingdom followed ancient Frankish custom, but created modern problems. The elder son, Charles, known to his Germanic followers as Karl, received the northern and eastern regions, the Austrasian heartlands where the family's military reputation had been earned, along with the challenging Saxon frontier, where constant warfare demanded proven leadership. His younger brother, Charlemagne, inherited the southern and western lands, richer territories that included Burgundy, Provence, and the approaches to Italy, regions where diplomatic skill mattered more than battlefield prowess. On the surface, this partition seemed equitable. Both brothers commanded substantial resources, controlled important trade routes, and could claim roughly equal numbers of warriors. Yet beneath this apparent balance lay profound differences that would soon transform royal cooperation into deadly rivalry. Geography itself seemed to mock their father's dying wish for unity, as their domains wrapped around each other in a complex embrace that made independent action nearly impossible. Charles's inheritance reflected both opportunity and burden. The eastern regions placed him at the forefront of Christian expansion, where glory could be won through campaigns against pagan Saxons and Slavic tribes. These were lands where his grandfather's reputation still commanded respect, and where warriors expected their leaders to prove themselves through personal courage in battle. Yet they were also territories where constant vigilance was the price of survival, where a single military defeat could open the gates to barbarian invasion. His brother's domains told a different story. Carloman's realm encompassed the ancient Roman heartlands of Gaul, territories with sophisticated urban centers, established administrative traditions, and complex relationships with ecclesiastical institutions. These were regions where political success depended more on negotiation than intimidation, where the ability to manage competing interests mattered more than skill with sword and spear. The younger brother had inherited not just land, but a way of life that differed fundamentally from the martial culture of the North and East. From the beginning, their contrasting personalities seemed perfectly matched to their respective challenges. The elder brother possessed the physical presence that Frankish warriors demanded in their leaders. He was tall, powerfully built, and gifted with the kind of natural charisma that could inspire men to follow him into desperate odds. Stories already circulated about his prowess in hunt and battle, his ability to break horses that had defeated other riders, and his capacity to march longer distances and endure greater hardships than men half his age. Charlemagne presented a study in contrasts. Where his brother was tall and imposing, the younger king was more modestly built, though still possessing the family's characteristic strength and energy. His talents lay not in the dramatic gestures that stirred warrior hearts, but in the patient accumulation of political advantages through careful alliance building and systematic administration. He understood the complex web of relationships that bound together the diverse populations of his southern domains, and he possessed an almost intuitive grasp of when to compromise and when to stand firm. Initially, these differences seemed complementary rather than divisive. When Saxon raids threatened the eastern frontier, Charlemagne provided military support that allowed his brother to launch devastating counterattacks deep into enemy territory. When diplomatic crises arose in Italy, Karl's reputation for military prowess gave weight to negotiations that his brother conducted with papal representatives and Lombard emissaries. The system appeared to be working as their father had intended. Yet the very success of their early cooperation contained the seeds of future conflict. Each brother's achievements highlighted what the other lacked, creating subtle competitions that gradually transformed brotherly rivalry into something more dangerous. Charles's military victories generated the kind of heroic reputation that attracted warriors from across Europe, young men seeking to prove themselves in the service of a leader whose name was already being sung in the halls of distant kingdoms. Charlemagne's diplomatic triumphs, while equally important for the realm's security, generated less dramatic acclaim and attracted fewer followers eager for glory. The first serious crack in their relationship appeared during the crisis in Aquitaine, where Duke Hunald had emerged from monastic retirement to challenge royal control over his ancestral lands. This rebellion threatened both brothers' interests, as Aquitaine's strategic position controlled the routes between their domains, and its vast resources could tip the balance of strength between them. Traditional custom demanded that they cooperate in suppressing this challenge to royal prerogative, but their response revealed how differently they understood their roles as rulers. True to form, the elder brother took a straightforward path, quickly raising his forces through the long-established warrior ties his family had built. His army moved south with the disciplined efficiency that had become a hallmark of northern military organization, and his personal leadership in the campaigns that followed added new chapters to the already impressive catalogue of his military achievements. The suppression of Hunald's rebellion was swift, thorough, and conducted with the kind of calculated brutality that would discourage future challenges to royal rule. What made this campaign politically significant was not its military success, but Charlemagne's response to his brother's call for assistance. Despite their formal alliance and the obvious threat that Aquitanian independence posed to both their interests, the younger brother found reasons to delay his support, citing pressing concerns in his own territories that required immediate attention. His forces remained concentrated in the south, while Karl's army bore the full burden of suppressing the rebellion. This failure to provide expected military aid sent shockwaves through the political networks that bound the royal brothers together. Warriors who had served both kings began choosing sides, recognizing that the facade of unity was cracking, and that future advancement might depend on backing the right claimant in an eventual succession struggle. Noble families who had maintained careful neutrality between the brothers found themselves forced to make choices that would determine their fate for generations. More ominously, foreign powers began adjusting their diplomatic strategies to account for the growing rift between the royal siblings. The Lombard kingdom in Italy, which had been contained by the threat of unified action from both brothers, sensed opportunity in their division. Pope Stephen III, who had relied on the dynasty's military protection since his predecessor's fateful journey north, found himself forced to choose between potential allies whose interests were diverging. Even distant powers like the Byzantine Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate began recalculating their policies toward the northern kingdoms in light of this unexpected weakness. Papal influence brought both complication and clarity, ultimately shaping the course of the conflict. When the Pope sought military assistance against renewed Lombard aggression, both brothers recognized that their response would determine not just their relationship with Rome, but their standing among the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Papal approval had been crucial to their father's transformation from mayor to king, and maintaining church support remained essential to their dynasty's continued legitimacy. The elder brother's response was swift and unequivocal. He committed substantial forces to the defense of papal territories, personally leading expeditions across the Alps that demonstrated both his military capabilities and his commitment to the church's protection. These campaigns added to his growing reputation as the premier Christian warrior of his generation, the natural successor to his grandfather's role as defender of the faith against pagan and heretical enemies. Carloman's reaction was more cautious and ultimately more damaging to his political position. While he did not openly oppose church interests, his support was qualified and conditional, hedged with diplomatic reservations that suggested he was not fully committed to the papal alliance that had been so crucial to his family's rise. This perceived lukewarm commitment to Christian defense cost him credibility, not just with ecclesiastical authorities, but with the warrior networks that formed the backbone of royal military strength. Their opposing responses to the crisis with the Pope became a key moment, one that would shape the course of their rivalry. Charles emerged as the Pope's preferred protector, the king whose commitment to church interests could be counted upon without reservation. Carloman found himself increasingly isolated, his cautious approach interpreted as weakness or unreliability by allies who expected decisive leadership from their rulers. By 770, the pretense of brotherly cooperation had become impossible to maintain. The two kingdoms functioned as separate entities, with competing interests and conflicting policies. Diplomatic correspondence between the royal courts took on the formal tone usually reserved for foreign powers, while military preparations along their shared frontiers suggested that both sides were preparing for the possibility of open conflict. The final break came over marriage alliances, those diplomatic tools that medieval rulers used to cement relationships and signal their intentions to the wider world. The elder brother's decision to marry a Lombard princess, a political arrangement that served his interests in Italian affairs, but contradicted the anti-Lombard policy that both brothers had inherited from their father, represented more than a diplomatic shift. It was a declaration of independence that made clear his intention to pursue his own agenda, regardless of Carloman's preferences. Carloman's response was predictably hostile. He viewed his brother's marriage alliance as a betrayal of family policy and a direct threat to his own interests in Italian affairs. The younger king began mobilizing his own diplomatic resources, reaching out to enemies of the Lombard kingdom and making clear his opposition to any expansion of their influence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just which brother would ultimately rule, but what direction the realm would take in its relations with the complex political landscape of medieval Europe. But just as tensions reached their peak and both camps braced for open war, fate took a sudden and unforeseen turn. In December 771, at the moment when the royal brothers seemed poised for civil war, Charlemagne fell suddenly ill while hunting in the forests near Samusi. Contemporary accounts describe a rapid decline that baffled physicians and worried courtiers. A mysterious sickness that struck down a young man in apparent good health. Within days, the 20-year-old king was dead, leaving behind a young widow, infant sons, and a kingdom whose fate now hung in the balance. The speed of his decline sparked whispers of poison and conspiracy, though no evidence ever emerged to support such theories. What mattered was not the cause of Charlemagne's death, but its consequences for the political structure that had governed the realm since their father's passing. Karl's response to his brother's death revealed the political instincts that would make him legendary. Rather than allowing Charlemagne's domains to pass to his infant sons, under a regency that might challenge royal unity, the surviving brother moved with decisive speed to assert his own claims to the entire inheritance. He presented himself not as a conqueror, seizing his nephew's rightful heritage, but as the natural protector of the realm's unity against the dangers of minority rule. This assertion of unified royal control required careful management of the political networks that had supported his brother's independent rule. Noble families who had backed Charlemagne faced the delicate task of transferring their loyalty to his surviving sibling without appearing treacherous to their former lord's memory. Ecclesiastical authorities who had maintained separate relationships with both courts needed to recalibrate their positions to acknowledge the new reality of single royal rule. Most challenging of all was the management of Charlemagne's widow and children, whose very existence represented alternative focuses for loyalty that could threaten the newly unified kingdom. Gerberga, the queen mother, chose the path of wisdom and withdrew with her sons to the Lombard court, removing potential rallying points for opposition while signaling her acceptance of the new political order. This tactical retreat eliminated the immediate threat of civil war, while leaving open future possibilities for her children's claims. By the beginning of 772, the unification was complete. What had been two separate kingdoms with competing policies and conflicting interests was now a single realm under unified leadership. The vast territories that the Hammer had conquered and the Short King had legitimized were finally ruled by a single hand, creating opportunities for coordinated action that had been impossible during the period of division. The transformation was more than administrative. It represented a fundamental shift in the possibilities available to Northern European Christian leadership. With the resources of the entire realm at his disposal, Karl could contemplate military and political enterprises that would have been impossible for either brother acting alone. The unification had created not just a larger kingdom, but a qualitatively different kind of power that could project influence across the known world. Still, gathering authority in one place brought more than just control. It also sparked rising demands and unforeseen complications. The unified realm's subjects now looked to a single ruler for leadership in all areas of life, from military defense against external enemies to the resolution of internal disputes that had previously been handled by separate royal courts. The king, who had inherited this vast responsibility, would need to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded even the impressive standards set by his predecessors. The stage was now set for the next phase of the dynasty's remarkable rise. The foundations laid by the Hammer's military innovations, strengthened by the Short King's alliance with church authorities, and unified through the elimination of internal division, were ready to support enterprises that would dwarf the achievements of previous generations. The young king, who stood at the apex of this inherited structure, possessed not just the resources necessary for unprecedented expansion, but the vision and capability to transform those resources into lasting achievements. As 771 drew to a close, observers across Europe began to sense that something fundamental had changed in the balance of medieval politics. The Northern Kingdom was no longer divided against itself, but unified under a leader whose abilities were already becoming legendary. The boy who had been anointed alongside his father 17 years earlier was about to begin the campaigns that would make his name synonymous with European greatness for centuries to come. The king who emerged from the succession crisis of 771 was no longer merely another Frankish ruler struggling to maintain inherited territories. Charles, now sole master of lands stretching from the North Sea to the Pyrenees, possessed resources and opportunities that no European monarch had commanded since the fall of Rome. Yet with this unprecedented concentration of power came expectations that would have crushed lesser men. The Christian kingdoms of Europe looked to him for leadership against their enemies, while his own warriors demanded the glory and plunder that only continuous conquest could provide. His first great test came not from human enemies, but from the complex web of alliances and obligations that bound medieval rulers together. Marriage to the Lombard princess that had so enraged his late brother now became a diplomatic liability, tying him to a kingdom whose aggressive expansion threatened the papal territories he was sworn to protect. When Pope Adrian the Feuillan sent desperate appeals for aid against King Desiderius of the Lombards, the young monarch faced a choice that would define his reign: honor his marriage alliance or defend the church that had legitimized his dynasty's rule. The decision revealed the calculating mind behind the warrior's facade. In a move that shocked contemporary observers, Charles repudiated his Lombard wife after less than a year of marriage, sending her back to her father's court with a brutality that made clear his priorities. Marriage, however politically advantageous, could not be allowed to compromise his position as defender of Christendom. The personal cost of this choice, the diplomatic humiliation, the accusations of faithlessness, the potential for future Lombard revenge, was less important than maintaining the papal alliance that formed the cornerstone of his dynasty's legitimacy. War with the Lombardy kingdom became inevitable once the marriage alliance collapsed. After the insult to his daughter, King Desiderius recognized the threat that a hostile northern kingdom posed to his own ambitions and began mobilizing for what promised to be a conflict of unprecedented scale. The Lombard realm commanded substantial resources, possessed sophisticated military traditions inherited from centuries of warfare against Byzantines and Muslims, and could field armies that had proven their effectiveness in the complex political landscape of 8th century Italy. Assumptions about northern weakness proved fatally flawed. Desiderius underestimated the transformation that had occurred north of the Alps. Armies that crossed into Italy in 773 bore little resemblance to the traditional raiding bands that had characterized earlier interventions. These troops moved with the disciplined coordination that 3 generations of innovation had perfected, supplied by logistical systems that could sustain operations far from home regions, and led by commanders who understood siege techniques as well as they mastered cavalry tactics. What came next showed the remarkable transformation of northern forces, far removed from their more primitive beginnings. Where previous expeditions had sought quick victories and rapid withdrawal, this invasion aimed at nothing less than the complete destruction of Lombard independence. City after city fell to systematic siege operations that combined traditional Germanic ferocity with Roman engineering techniques learned from captured regions, and recruited specialists. The great fortress of Pavia, crown jewel of the Lombard kingdom, found itself surrounded by earthworks and artillery that its defenders had never imagined possible. The siege of Pavia lasted nearly a year, becoming a testing ground for innovations that would reshape European combat. Northern engineers, working alongside Italian specialists who had transferred their loyalty to the invaders, developed new techniques for undermining walls and coordinating artillery strikes. Supply trains maintained constant communication with lands north of the Alps, ensuring that the besieging armies could outlast defenders who had counted on the traditional pattern of seasonal operations to save them. Victory at Pavia opened new horizons of possibility. When the great fortress finally fell in June 774, this triumph represented more than battlefield success. It announced the arrival of a new kind of power, capable of projecting strength across vast distances and sustaining operations until decisive results were achieved. Desiderius himself was captured and sent to spend his remaining years in a monastery, while his kingdom was absorbed into the expanding northern realm. For the first time since the collapse of Roman authority, a single ruler controlled lands stretching from the English Channel to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Adriatic. Assuming the title King of the Lombards alongside his existing dignities marked a crucial step in his transformation from regional monarch to European hegemon. Rather than merely adding conquered territory to existing domains, this represented the creation of a new form of composite monarchy that could accommodate diverse populations under unified leadership. Italian nobles who submitted to the new regime found themselves incorporated into court structures that blended northern warrior traditions with sophisticated administrative practices inherited from Roman and Byzantine predecessors. Even as he celebrated victory in Italy, greater challenges were emerging along the Saxon frontier, where his dynasty had first proven its prowess. Pagan tribes beyond the Rhine had watched the Lombard conquest with growing alarm, recognizing that their traditional strategies of raiding and withdrawal would prove inadequate against an enemy who possessed both the resources and determination to pursue systematic subjugation. The Saxons began preparing for what they understood would be a war of survival against forces bent on their complete subjugation or destruction. The wars against the Saxons that began in earnest in 772 would define the reign more than any other conflict, consuming decades of effort and testing every aspect of the organizational systems that had made earlier victories possible. These were not battles for territorial gain or dynastic glory, but religious crusades aimed at extending Christian dominion over pagan populations who had resisted conversion for centuries. The fusion of martial ambition with spiritual purpose created a form of combat that was both more intensive and more brutal than anything seen in previous conflicts. Saxon society presented challenges that differed fundamentally from those encountered in Italy or Gaul. Where the Lombards had possessed centralized leadership that could negotiate surrender and transfer authority to conquerors, the Saxon tribes were organized around localized chieftains who could continue resistance even after major defeats. Their intimate knowledge of the forested terrain beyond the Rhine allowed them to employ guerrilla tactics that frustrated enemies accustomed to decisive battlefield victories. Most importantly, their pagan religious traditions provided ideological foundations for resistance that made compromise or accommodation extremely difficult. Responding to this challenge required both strategic brilliance and systematic brutality. Rather than seeking to dominate Saxon lands through traditional battlefield victories, the king implemented a comprehensive program designed to destroy the cultural and religious foundations of Saxon independence. Sacred groves were cut down and burned, pagan shrines were demolished, and replaced with Christian churches, and traditional leaders were systematically eliminated and replaced with administrators loyal to the new regime. The most infamous episode of this cultural war occurred at Verdun in 782, where thousands of Saxon prisoners were executed in a single day following their defeat in battle. Contemporary chroniclers, even those sympathetic to the king's religious mission, expressed shock at the scale of the massacre. Yet this calculated brutality served a strategic purpose that extended beyond mere revenge. It demonstrated that resistance to Christian authority would be met with consequences so terrible that they would discourage future rebellions. Widukind, the Saxon leader, proved to be the king's toughest adversary yet, a compelling figure whose talent for uniting tribes pushed the conquest strategy to its limits. Widukind understood that Saxon survival depended on transforming localized resistance into a coordinated national struggle, and his success in maintaining guerrilla warfare for over a decade demonstrated tactical sophistication that forced fundamental adaptations in northern military doctrine. Their battle grew into more than war. It became a confrontation between two worldviews, led by men whose rivalry was as personal as it was strategic. The Christian king represented the forces of civilization, administrative efficiency, and religious orthodoxy, while the pagan chieftain embodied traditional values of tribal independence, religious diversity, and resistance to foreign domination. Their prolonged conflict captured the imagination of contemporaries who recognized that its outcome would determine the future character of European civilization. It was a calculated blend of pressure and innovation that allowed Widukind to steadily weaken Saxon resistance over time. Fortified settlements established in conquered regions provided bases for continued operations while demonstrating the permanence of the new regime. Road networks connecting these strongholds allowed rapid movement of forces to threatened areas, while facilitating the kind of economic integration that made rebellion increasingly costly for local populations. Religious conversion, enforced through a combination of incentives and penalties, undermined the ideological foundations of Saxon resistance, while creating new sources of loyalty to the Christian monarchy. Pagan leaders who accepted baptism found themselves incorporated into the expanding administrative structure, while those who maintained traditional beliefs faced systematic persecution designed to drive them into exile or submission. The construction of churches and monasteries in former pagan territories provided visible symbols of the new order's permanence, while creating networks of clerical support for continued expansion. The submission of Widukind in 785 marked the effective end of organized Saxon resistance, though sporadic rebellions would continue for several more years. The pagan chieftain's decision to accept baptism represented more than personal conversion. It was an acknowledgement that traditional Saxon society could not survive in the face of the military, administrative, and cultural pressures that the Christian kingdom could bring to bear. His integration into the royal court as a trusted advisor demonstrated the king's ability to transform former enemies into supporters of the new order. Patterns of growth and assimilation established during the Saxon conquest echoed throughout the remainder of the rule. Military campaigns aimed not merely at territorial acquisition, but at the systematic transformation of conquered populations through forced conversion, administrative reorganization, and cultural assimilation. The fusion of warfare with missionary activity created a form of expansionism that was both more intensive and more durable than traditional conquest, as it aimed to remake conquered territories in the image of the conqueror's own society. Simultaneous with the Saxon Wars, Campaigns in Bavaria and against the Avars extended the realm's frontiers deep into Central Europe, while securing vast quantities of treasure that financed continued expansion. The systematic destruction of the Avar Confederation, nomadic peoples who had terrorized settled populations for generations, removed a major threat to European security while adding enormous wealth to the royal treasuries. The distribution of this plunder among loyal followers created bonds of obligation that strengthened the military networks essential to continued conquest. Administrative challenges posed by these rapid territorial acquisitions forced fundamental innovations in governmental organization. Traditional systems of personal loyalty and seasonal operations proved inadequate for governing sedentary populations across vast distances. New forms of regional administration, combining military command with civilian governance, were developed to maintain royal authority in territories far from the court's immediate presence. Marches, fortified frontier districts, were designed not only to protect recently claimed territory, but also to serve as launch points for ongoing expansion. These border commands combined the responsibilities of military leadership, civil administration, and religious conversion, creating a new class of regional governors whose authority derived directly from royal appointment rather than traditional aristocratic privilege. By 785, the transformation was complete. What had been a regional Frankish monarchy had become a European empire commanding resources and populations that dwarfed any power seen since the fall of Rome. The king, who had inherited a divided realm, had forged it into a unified instrument of expansion that could project power across the continent while maintaining internal stability through systematic administration and religious unity. The foundations had been laid for achievements that would soon overshadow even these remarkable early conquests. The young monarch, who had once shared power with his brother, now stood alone at the apex of Christian Europe, his authority acknowledged from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Yet even these vast dominions represented only the beginning of ambitions that would soon encompass the restoration of imperial dignity to Western Europe. The sword had been unsheathed and proven its effectiveness. Now it remained to be seen whether the cross could transform military conquest into lasting imperial authority. Charlemagne was already an emperor indeed. Soon he would become one in name. Snow was falling on the palace at Aachen when the messenger arrived from Saxony with news that would have terrified any other ruler. Widukind was dead, but 3 separate Saxon chiefs had proclaimed themselves his successor, each demanding tribute from neighboring settlements, each claiming divine authority to restore pagan rule. Charles listened to the report in silence, then dismissed the messenger with a gesture that had become familiar to his courtiers, not the violent hand movement of a warrior reaching for his sword, but the measured motion of a man accustomed to solving problems with something more powerful than steel. Within hours, identical letters were speeding toward every corner of his vast domains, not carried by exhausted riders racing through winter storms, but by a network of professional messengers who changed horses at predetermined stations, who followed roads maintained by royal engineers, who carried documents written in a script so standardized that a monk in Barcelona could read orders composed in Aachen without difficulty. The Saxon crisis would be resolved not by gathering warriors for a spring campaign, but by administrative machinery that could coordinate responses across 1,000 miles. In the scriptorium at Tours, Alcuin of York paused in his copying of Augustine's City of God to examine one such letter. The Northumbrian scholar who had transformed illiterate warrior sons into literate administrators could read between the lines of royal prose. 3 counts would march from different directions to converge on Saxon territory, their movements timed to prevent the rebels from uniting. Local churches would provide intelligence about which chiefs commanded genuine support and which were merely opportunists. Most importantly, Saxon nobles who had accepted baptism would be offered rewards for betraying their pagan rivals, turning the rebellion into civil war. Your Majesty governs through ink and parchment as much as iron and steel, Alcuin had once observed to Charles during one of their evening discussions in the palace library. Now, watching royal policy unfold across the continent with mechanical precision, he understood that something unprecedented had been created in Northern Europe. Not just a larger kingdom, but a different kind of political organization entirely. One that could think, plan, and act with a coordination that made traditional tribal societies seem primitive by comparison. The evidence surrounded him daily in the palace complex that had risen from the Aachen marshlands. Foreign ambassadors who arrived expecting to find another barbarian chieftain in a wooden hall instead encountered marble columns, gold mosaics, and a throne room that deliberately echoed the great churches of Constantinople. When Harun al-Rashid's envoys presented their master's gifts, an elephant, a mechanical clock, and silk tapestries that had required years to weave, they did so in surroundings that proclaimed their recipients' equality with the Caliph of Baghdad. Still, the true revolution was occurring not in palace halls, but in cathedral schools scattered across the realm. At Corby, young monks who would once have spent their lives in agricultural labor now studied geometry and astronomy under masters who had been trained in the palace school. Their vellum pages filled with calculations that would determine the proper dates for religious festivals, architectural plans for churches that would dwarf anything built since Rome's fall, and correspondence with scholars in distant monasteries who shared their intellectual passions. Brother Einhard, the tiny Frank who served as the king's biographer, had witnessed this transformation firsthand. Born to peasant parents who could neither read nor write, he now commanded a scriptorium that produced more books in a single year than many kingdoms had accumulated in their entire histories. His life of the emperor, for Einhard had already begun thinking of his master in imperial terms, would be copied in dozens of monasteries, its elegant Latin prose carrying the story of northern achievement to every corner of Christian Europe. The morning conferences in the palace revealed how completely warfare itself had been transformed by these innovations. Maps covered tables where tribal leaders had once relied on personal knowledge of local terrain. Supply calculations determined the feasibility of operations that earlier generations would have decided through ritual consultation with shamans. Most remarkably, campaign plans now accounted for the administrative requirements of governing conquered territories, rather than simply defeating their armies. "We do not merely conquer," Charles had explained to his son Pippin during one such session. "We transform. Every pagan grove becomes a Christian church. Every tribal chief becomes a count serving the crown. Every local custom becomes part of imperial law. Our enemies defeat themselves by trying to resist what their own people come to prefer." This philosophy was being tested in the Spanish borderlands, where local Christian populations had begun requesting incorporation into the northern realm rather than remaining under Islamic rule. The refugees who crossed the Pyrenees brought with them knowledge of Islamic architecture, agriculture, and scholarship that enriched the very kingdom they sought to join. Former enemies became subjects, subjects became citizens, and citizens became the administrators who extended royal authority into new territories. Economic transformation accompanied political innovation as silver flowed into royal treasuries from sources that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Not merely the plunder of conquered enemies, but systematic taxation of commercial activities that flourished under imperial protection. Merchants who had once feared to travel beyond their local territories now carried goods from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, their profits subject to tariffs that filled royal coffers, while their safety was guaranteed by imperial law. The Great Fair at Saint-Denis had become a symbol of this commercial revolution. Here, beneath the shadows of the royal abbey, traders from a dozen different kingdoms conducted business using standardized weights and measures, their transactions recorded by clerks who understood Arabic numerals as well as Roman calculation methods. When disputes arose, they were resolved not by trial combat, but by judges who applied written laws that treated all parties equally regardless of their ethnic origins. Governing such a varied population demanded legal creativity. Though united under one authority, Saxons, Lombards, and Franks still followed distinct laws born from separate histories. Royal courts developed procedures for resolving conflicts between parties, operating under different legal traditions, creating a body of jurisprudence that would influence European law for centuries. The Missae Dominici, who travelled predetermined circuits to monitor this vast administrative machine, represented perhaps the most innovative aspect of the entire system. These paired inspectors, one cleric, one layman, possessed authority that superseded local officials while remaining accountable to central control. Their reports revealed corruption, inefficiency, and abuse of power, with a systematic thoroughness that would have been impossible under traditional forms of personal rule. Abbot Fulrad of Saint-Denis, serving his third decade as a royal inspector, had witnessed the system's evolution from improvised expedient to sophisticated institution. His circuits now followed predetermined schedules that allowed him to audit the same territories at regular intervals, comparing current conditions with detailed records from previous visits. Local officials who had initially viewed his appearances as intrusions now welcomed his arrival as opportunities to resolve problems that exceeded their individual capabilities. Religious policy during these years revealed Charles's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between spiritual unity and political stability. Rather than simply imposing uniform practices on diverse populations, royal policy encouraged local variations that did not threaten doctrinal orthodoxy. Jewish communities found protection under imperial law. Eastern Christian refugees received settlement opportunities, and even pagan traditions were sometimes adapted rather than destroyed when they could be given Christian interpretations. The monastery of Fulda had become a laboratory for these techniques of cultural integration. Here, Saxon converts worked alongside Frankish monks to translate Christian texts into Germanic languages, creating a literature that made the faith accessible to populations who had previously relied on oral tradition. Their illuminated manuscripts combined Germanic artistic traditions with Christian themes, producing works of art that were distinctly northern, yet unmistakably orthodox. Just like the civilian side of government, the military was built on a foundation of structure and strategic planning. Professional soldiers, supported by grants of royal land, provided continuity that citizen militias could not match. Training programs, standardized equipment, and tactics across units drawn from different ethnic groups, while promotion systems rewarded competence rather than birth. Most importantly, conquered populations were integrated into imperial armies, rather than simply being ruled by them, creating military forces that truly represented the diversity of the realm they served. The frontier regions, known as marches, provided testing grounds for innovations that would later be applied throughout the empire. Here, military commanders, who doubled as civil administrators, governed populations that included recent enemies, long-time allies, and refugees from territories still beyond imperial control. Their success in maintaining security while encouraging economic development demonstrated that the administrative techniques developed in the imperial heartland could function effectively under the most challenging conditions. Border management along the Danish frontier revealed how completely military thinking had evolved beyond traditional concepts of seasonal raiding. Fortified settlements provided permanent bases for operations, while serving as centers for the commercial and cultural activities that gradually extended imperial influence into previously hostile territories. Danish chieftains, who had initially viewed these settlements as military threats, increasingly saw them as opportunities for profitable cooperation with imperial authorities. With the empire ensuring security, cultural exchange thrived. Scholars, artisans, and traders crossed borders that had once kept worlds apart. Irish monks brought manuscript illumination techniques that influenced artistic development throughout the realm. Spanish refugees contributed mathematical and astronomical knowledge derived from Islamic sources. Italian craftsmen shared architectural methods that improved construction projects from England to Hungary. The palace school at Aachen had become the focal point for this intellectual renaissance. Its students, including young men from every corner of the known world. Here, the sons of Saxon chiefs studied alongside those of Lombard nobles, their common education in Latin, mathematics, and theology, creating bonds that transcended ethnic rivalries. When they returned to their home territories as administrators or churchmen, they carried with them not just technical knowledge, but a vision of European unity that had never existed before. Thanks to imperial investment and interest, technology evolved rapidly as new possibilities were explored and tested. The royal workshops at Aachen developed improved metallurgical techniques, more efficient agricultural tools, and architectural methods that allowed the construction of buildings larger than any seen in Northern Europe since antiquity. These innovations spread rapidly through networks of craftsmen who moved freely across imperial territories, carrying their knowledge to communities eager to benefit from imperial prosperity. No earlier European state had achieved such effective connectivity across its vast lands, thanks to improved communication systems. Road maintenance programs kept major routes passable year-round, while way stations provided lodging and fresh horses for official messengers. River navigation improvements opened water routes that reduced travel times and transportation costs. Most importantly, standardized procedures allowed local officials to coordinate their activities without constant central supervision. International recognition of imperial achievements reached unprecedented levels as foreign rulers acknowledged the northern kingdom's emergence as a great power. Byzantine emperors, initially dismissive of barbarian pretensions, found themselves negotiating as equals with a ruler whose territories rivaled their own in extent and exceeded them in military effectiveness. Even more remarkably, Islamic rulers, who had long regarded Christian Europe as a collection of weak principalities, began treating the northern king as a sovereign worthy of diplomatic attention. The elephant that Harun al-Rashid had sent as a diplomatic gift wandered the palace grounds at Aachen as a living symbol of these transformed relationships. Children who had never seen such a creature gathered daily to watch it being fed and exercised, while foreign visitors recognized it as proof that their host commanded respect from the greatest powers of the age. When the animal died after several years in northern captivity, its burial was attended by representatives from a dozen different kingdoms who understood the symbolic significance of honoring a gift from the Caliph of Baghdad. Strong economic foundations helped secure diplomatic gains, as imperial regions became essential players in trade stretching from Ireland to Central Asia. Goods that had once been luxury items available only to the greatest nobles now appeared in markets throughout the realm, their prices reduced by improved transportation and imperial protection of trade routes. Urban populations, previously tiny minorities in overwhelmingly rural societies, grew rapidly as commercial opportunities attracted craftsmen, merchants, and professionals from across Europe. All other advancements rested on breakthroughs in agriculture, where improved techniques led to a surge in productivity across the empire. The heavy moldboard plough, improved harness systems, and systematic crop rotation methods that had been tested on royal estates were gradually adopted by private landowners who recognized their advantages. Surplus production fed larger urban populations, supported more extensive military forces, and generated the wealth that financed scholarly activities. Yet even as these remarkable achievements accumulated, observers began to sense that something greater was approaching. The ruler who had transformed military conquest into sophisticated governance, who had created institutions that functioned across continental distances, who had revived learning and established diplomatic relations with the greatest powers of his age, remained merely a king among kings. His accomplishments suggested capabilities that transcended traditional royal authority, demanding recognition that matched their unprecedented scope. Standing in his palace at Aachen as the 8th century drew to a close, surrounded by scholars, administrators, and diplomats from across the known world, Charles could survey accomplishments that exceeded the dreams of any previous European ruler. Military conquest had been transformed into lasting governance, diverse populations had been united under effective administration, and cultural renaissance had elevated European civilization to heights not seen since antiquity. All that remained was formal recognition of what had already been achieved in practice, the restoration of imperial dignity to Western Europe. The year 800 was not the beginning of Charlemagne's empire. It was its recognition. Dawn broke grey and cold over Rome on Christmas morning, 800, as the king made his way through streets that had witnessed the rise and fall of Caesars for 8 centuries. The ruler, who had conquered half of Europe, walked with measured steps towards St. Peter's Basilica, his mind occupied not with thoughts of glory, but with the complex crisis that had brought him to the Eternal City. Pope Leo III, beaten bloody by Roman nobles and driven into exile, owed his restoration to northern swords. Now, as bells echoed across the 7 hills, that debt was about to be repaid in ways that would reshape the medieval world. Inside the great basilica, candles blazed against the December darkness, while incense hung heavy in the winter air. Foreign ambassadors filled the nave, Byzantine officials who had come expecting another barbarian king's ceremonial submission to papal rule, Lombard nobles still adjusting to their new northern masters, and Spanish refugees who saw in the monarch their last hope against Islamic expansion. None suspected they were about to witness the rebirth of an empire that had been dead for over 3 centuries. The king knelt before the altar in the posture of Christian humility, his powerful frame bent in prayer as Pope Leo conducted the familiar rituals of Christmas Mass. Latin prayers echoed off ancient stones, their sacred words carrying the same meaning they bore for Constantine and Justinian, for the Christian rulers who had once governed from these same hills. Yet something in the Pope's manner suggested this would be no ordinary service. A tension in his movements, a deliberation in his gestures that hinted at drama to come. Then, without warning, without consultation, without the elaborate protocols that had always surrounded such momentous decisions, Leo stepped forward, carrying a golden crown that gleamed in the candlelight. As the congregation held its collective breath, the Pope placed the crown upon the monarch's head, while pronouncing words that would echo through history. Life and victory to Charles the Great, crowned by God, great and peace-giving Emperor of the Romans. Thunder seemed to shake the basilica as thousands of voices took up the acclamation. Charles Augustus, to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving Emperor of the Romans, life and victory. The words rolled through the ancient church like a tide, carrying with them 8 centuries of yearning for the imperial unity that had once bound the Western world together. In that moment of thunderous acclaim, the fiction that had sustained medieval politics, that Rome had merely faded rather than fallen, became magnificent reality once more. The king's reaction to his elevation would be debated by chroniclers for generations. Einhard, his devoted biographer, would later claim the monarch was genuinely surprised by Leo's action and would never have entered the church had he known what was planned. Others detected satisfaction rather than shock in their new sovereign's bearing, suggesting the ceremony fulfilled plans that had been carefully orchestrated despite their apparent spontaneity. What seemed certain was that the newly crowned ruler understood immediately the transformation that had occurred. He was no longer merely another barbarian king, but Caesar reborn, heir to Augustus and Constantine. Was the ceremony Leo's desperate gambit to bind his protector with chains of sacred obligation? Had the king himself orchestrated the entire drama to provide religious sanction for dominion he already wielded in practice? Or did the moment emerge from the convergence of circumstances that made the unprecedented seem inevitable? The truth disappeared into the necessities that required both sovereign and pope to maintain the fiction of divine spontaneity. But the consequences would reshape European civilization, regardless of the motives that produced them. News of the coronation spread across Europe with the speed of wildfire, carrying implications that varied dramatically depending on where it was received. In the monasteries and cathedral schools of the north, monks who had labored to preserve classical learning saw their efforts vindicated by the restoration of imperial dignity to Christian hands. In the courts of petty kings who had ruled through the chaos of the post-Roman centuries, the emergence of an emperor who could command legitimate obedience created both opportunities and threats that would dominate politics for decades to come. Byzantine reaction proved swift and hostile, as Emperor Irene refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of Charles's coronation. From Constantinople, the rulers who had maintained an unbroken claim to Roman imperial authority since the fall of the West now faced a rival whose military power exceeded their own and whose religious credentials could not be easily dismissed. The golden coins that emerged from northern mints, bearing Charles's image and the title Emperor of the Romans, represented more than ceremonial pretension. They were declarations of war against Byzantine claims to exclusive imperial legitimacy. Yet even as Constantinople raged against barbarian presumption, Latin Christendom erupted in celebration. From Ireland to Italy, from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, Christian populations who had endured centuries of political fragmentation saw hope restored in the crown that now rested on Charles's brow. The empire that had brought law, order, and prosperity to their ancestors had returned, reborn in the person of a Germanic warrior whose conquests had already demonstrated his worthiness to bear imperial authority. What made this imperial restoration unique in medieval history was not its military foundation. Barbarian leaders had claimed imperial titles before, but its institutional sophistication. The administrative machinery that Charles had developed to govern his vast kingdom proved capable of supporting truly imperial responsibilities. The legal systems that had standardized justice across diverse populations could be expanded to encompass the universal jurisdiction that imperial authority implied. Most importantly, the cultural renaissance that had flourished under royal patronage now possessed the dignity and resources necessary to rival the achievements of classical antiquity. The old Western Roman Empire was indeed reborn on Christmas Day 800, but it emerged from the baptismal waters of medieval Christianity, transformed almost beyond recognition. Where the classical empire had been sustained by slave labor and military conquest, this new imperial order drew its strength from agricultural innovation and religious unity. Where Roman emperors had ruled through professional bureaucracies, responsible only to imperial will, the Christian emperor governed through networks of obligation that bound him to his subjects through ties of mutual responsibility, sanctified by religious oath. Charles now commanded the most powerful Christian state in Europe, his authority acknowledged from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The kingdoms that had emerged from Rome's collapse, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the myriad tribal confederations that had carved up imperial territories, had all been absorbed into this new synthesis of Germanic military prowess, Roman administrative genius, and Christian spiritual purpose. For the first time since the 5th century, Western Europe possessed a unified political structure capable of defending itself against external enemies while promoting internal development. The coronation ended the post-Roman vacuum that had defined European politics for over 3 centuries. The interregnum, during which no legitimate authority could claim universal jurisdiction over Christian territories, was finally over, replaced by an imperial dignity that combined the military effectiveness of barbarian kingdoms with the cultural sophistication of classical civilization. Future rulers would measure themselves against Charles's example, while future political theorists would struggle to understand the institutional innovations that had made his empire possible. Still, the most profound transformation was not political, but psychological. Europeans who had grown accustomed to thinking of themselves as inhabitants of failed kingdoms ruling over the ruins of a greater past could now see themselves as citizens of a restored empire, capable of rivaling the achievements of antiquity. The intellectual renaissance that had begun in monastery schools and palace libraries now possessed the confidence that came from serving not merely successful kings, but a legitimate emperor whose authority derived from God himself. This psychological transformation extended far beyond the educated elites who produced chronicles and legal documents. Common soldiers who had followed Charles through decades of campaigns now understood they served not just another successful warlord, but the heir to Caesar and Augustus. Peasants who paid taxes to support imperial administration could see their contributions as investments in a political order that promised lasting peace and prosperity. Most importantly, the diverse populations that had been forged into imperial unity through conquest now possessed shared identity as subjects of a restored empire that transcended ethnic and linguistic divisions. The Holy Roman Empire that would dominate medieval European politics for 8 centuries had its origins in that moment of candlelight and incense when Pope Leo placed the crown upon Charles's head. The title Holy Roman Emperor would pass to his successors, carrying with it claims to universal authority over Christian Europe that would outlast the military power that had made such claims credible. The institutional innovations that had made Charles's empire possible, the synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Christian traditions, would influence European political development long after his particular empire had fragmented into competing kingdoms. Standing in St. Peter's Basilica as the acclamations echoed around him, the newly crowned emperor could survey achievements that exceeded the dreams of any previous European ruler. The bastard son of a mayor, had become the legitimate heir to Caesar. The barbarian kingdom north of the Alps had evolved into a restored empire. Most importantly, the fragmented political landscape of post-Roman Europe had been replaced by an imperial unity that promised to endure long beyond any individual ruler's lifetime. Spring brought the new emperor's departure from Rome, but he carried with him more than ceremonial dignity. The crown that rested on his brow represented formal acknowledgement of authority he had already wielded for decades, but it also created expectations and obligations that would define the remainder of his reign. Imperial status demanded imperial behavior, not just successful warfare, but systematic governance, not just personal charisma, but institutional innovation, not just military dominance, but cultural leadership that could justify claims to universal authority. Charles returned to Aachen in triumph, his palace complex now serving as the capital of a restored empire, rather than merely the seat of a successful kingdom. Foreign ambassadors who had previously negotiated with another barbarian king now found themselves dealing with an emperor whose claims to legitimacy rested on divine sanction as well as military success. The administrative machinery that had governed diverse populations across vast territories now operated with enhanced authority that derived from imperial coronation rather than mere conquest. From Aachen, the emperor would rule for 14 more years, his reign marked by the systematic consolidation of achievements that had made imperial restoration possible. The legal codes that had standardized justice across his territories were refined and expanded. The educational institutions that had produced literate administrators were strengthened and multiplied. The military organization that had conquered half of Europe was adapted to serve the defensive needs of an empire that had achieved its natural boundaries. Even with his new imperial title, the core traits that defined him stayed much the same. The emperor who now claimed authority over all Christian Europe continued to rise before dawn for personal prayer, to personally review administrative details that lesser rulers would have delegated, and to maintain the physical vigor that had made him legendary among his warriors. Imperial coronation had enhanced rather than replaced the personal qualities that had made his rise to power possible. When death finally claimed the emperor in 814, he left behind more than territories or institutions. He had restored to Western Europe the confidence that came from belonging to a civilization capable of greatness. The empire he bequeathed to his successors would fragment and transform over the centuries. But the example he had set would inspire generations of rulers who sought to combine military success with cultural achievement, temporal authority with spiritual purpose, barbarian vigor with classical sophistication. In the glow of candlelight and incense on Christmas Day 800, a Germanic warrior had indeed become Caesar, and the West had its emperor once more. The age of barbarian kingdoms was ending. The age of empire had begun anew.